Hi, can you all hear me? So I'm going to try to keep this as entertaining as I can. If at the end of this you still want to be couch potatoes, I've done a bad job. I do a lot of speaking and lecturing, mostly to medical or scientific audiences. I'm aware that you may not have as much. I think you're all smarter than most of my colleagues, so that's a good thing, and me. So it's not a matter of comprehension, but some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is a little bit technical. I'm going to try to keep it as non-technical as possible. Some of the illustrations and slides are the kinds of things that we would show to audiences who've had some degree of either medical education or other education. So I apologize for that. It's not quite as sort of non-technical as I might have liked, but it'll give you a little bit of a taste for how we present information to technical audiences. I'm going to try to keep it as sort of non-technical as possible. Please stop me if I say anything that either doesn't make sense. I'm happy to be interrupted. I'll leave lots of time for questions because I want to make this as interactive as possible. We can talk about research, sports cardiology, anything you want. How to hit a good topspin backhand because I'm a tennis player. It doesn't matter. Whatever you like to talk about that you think is interesting for you, we'll talk about. Sports cardiology is a relatively new enterprise. There's lots of things that are new in medicine, as you probably may know, because we have more tools at our disposal than we did 30, 40 years ago. When I went to medical school, a lot of the testing that we do today that allows us to look at the heart, physically watch it work, weren't available. We had chest x-rays, which doesn't really tell you the heart is moving, it's just a still picture. We had a stethoscope, so you can listen to the heart. That gives you some amount of information. We could take the patient's heart rate and blood pressure, but we couldn't do a lot of the things that we do today, which include tests like the ultrasound of the heart, the same ultrasound machines, that same technology that radar uses to sonar to know where the depth of the seafloor is. Basically sound waves bouncing off a reflective surface. So the same technology now allows us with exquisite accuracy to see the heart in real life working. It's the same technology that we used to look at babies in the womb. So ultrasound is now commonplace. We look at a lot of things inside the body with ultrasound, but the heart is one of the places where the technology has allowed us to understand how the heart works very well. There's another technology which is called the MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, which is basically putting the body inside a magnetic field, and the electrons line up. We don't have to get into the physics of it, but the way in which the magnetic fields allow energy to bounce back to the detector allows us pictures of the heart. So much of what I'm going to tell you about is in part based on two kinds of science. It's really sort of what exercise does to the heart. And this is relatively new, so the field is new. One is we now, because in the last 20 or 30 years, we've started to understand that if you really want to know something about the body, you really want to know something about a particular problem. Let's say, what happens to an athlete after 30 years of exercise? Or what happens to somebody with high blood pressure after 30 years of high blood pressure? Or what happens to somebody with diabetes after 30 years of diabetes? You need to do research where you have a lot of individuals who have the condition we're talking about. I'm giving you this is a side spin here, but please bear with me. In order to understand what happens to individuals, whether it's health or disease, we have to have the means of gathering a lot of people. You can't just take one person who's an athlete and see what happens to them, because it could have been by coincidence. You need a lot of people. We're talking about tens of thousands who are athletes, or tens of thousands of people with diabetes or high blood pressure, and watch them over time and see what happens to them. Do they get sick? Do they get better? Do the treatments make them better? What happens to the progress of the condition? And this has only been done in the last 10 or 20 years. So we now have the privilege, those of us interested in cardiology and sport, of understanding much better what happens to athletes after 10, 20, 30 years of sport, and also this precise measurement of what does the heart look like in athletes as opposed to in non-athletes. So that's the context, that's the background of the kind of stuff we're going to talk about. But that approach applies to all kinds of medical science, not only to cardiology and not only to sport cardiology. The reason it's become more interesting for people or more newsworthy. I'll talk about what's on the slide in a minute, but the part of the reason why this whole field has become newsworthy is three things. First of all, there are way more people doing sport than there used to be. We always had teenagers, people in their 20s doing sport. The Olympics have been around for a very long time. So the idea that some few people do a lot of sport is not new. But that's a few people. Sport is now becoming culturally more important, partly because of professional sports, partly because if you're a pro athlete, you can make a lot of money and you become famous, so that's a good thing, I guess, if you're a pro athlete. Partly because individuals who are now middle-aged or older, for cultural reasons, I think this is a good thing, by the way, are much more likely to be athletes. In my parents' day, it was almost unheard of for somebody who's 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, running a marathon, playing, people played sports for entertainment, but to be really active and to be training for a race would be unheard of 50 years ago, after age 40. Now, if you go to a marathon, half the people there are over age 60. That's really new. So it makes us want to understand what the maybe benefits and what maybe the harms are of becoming or staying very active physically into old age. And people are living longer. 50 years ago, most people died at around age 65 or 70. Now, most people live to age 80, 85. So they're living longer and more active, and that makes us want to understand what is the relationship between sport activity and how long you live. So the questions that people ask, and whenever you're thinking about any scientific field, first you have to come up with a bunch of questions. When we think about science, and again, I'm digressing here, so I hope this is interesting to you. If not, just tell me to shut up and move on. When we think about science, the most important thing you have to start with is ask a question. If you're just wandering around the countryside looking at the trees, that's kind of nice. But if you really want to understand what the trees are, you have to ask yourself, well, I'm just giving you this as an example, what kind of trees are those? Are they deciduous? Are they evergreen? What do the leaves look like? What does that tell us about the landscape? As soon as you start asking questions, then you're going to be much better at getting answers. So that's what we try to do in sports cardiology. We have questions. So the questions that people ask are, what happens to the heart when you exercise intensively, right? Remember, 200,000 years ago, when there weren't Li Ka-shing buildings and there wasn't the Toronto, we were all living in small villages in the countryside, people had to work very hard to get food. You couldn't go to the 7-Eleven and get Doritos. There were no pizzas 100,000 years ago, right? So in evolutionary terms, all of us are evolved to be hunters and gatherers, which takes a lot of effort. So when we were evolved, all of us in this room, we basically were adapted to walking 100 miles at a time. I'm not exaggerating, 100 miles to gather firewood, to find game because people were meat eaters, or to go and find berries, or to escape the mastodons or escape the tigers or whatever. Life was hard during 100,000 years ago during evolution. So we are adapted to be exercisers, to run away from things that were chasing us and run towards things that we were chasing. Right? There were no cars, there were no guns, there were no bows and arrows. It was basically a spear and the hunter-gatherer going for find food, right? It was very difficult work. So we're adapted to activity. There wasn't hockey and basketball 100,000 years ago, but we were very physically active. So the question is, what does that mean today for modern human beings, where we don't have to hunt for food anymore and we don't have to hunt for firewood anymore, but we have sport as another kind of activity? What does that do? What does that mean for our hearts? The question also comes up because if you go on the internet and you type in sports cardiology or you type in endurance sport, what you'll see, this is what my patients tell me, what they see is, yeah, sport's pretty good, but if you do too much, it'll kill you. And I see patients all the time who have read or been told it's not true. So if you want to run a marathon, well, wait till I'm done. But if you want to run a marathon, be my guest. You're not going to hurt yourself unless you get run over. But it's a real issue. And of course, people read the internet and they get worried depending on what they see. So that's a common question. So the sport ever cardiotoxic is really an extension of that. The question I want to help answer for ourselves is, can you exercise too much? Can you exercise yourself into the ground? There's an interesting story, which is what leads to a lot of this thinking. There's a historical figure, it could be real, it could be just a fiction, named Phidippides. And in the Battle of Marathon, when the Greeks and the Spartans were fighting, Sparta was a very powerful country. It had lots of soldiers, and they were much stronger than the Greeks, but the Greeks managed to win this battle, and he had to run back to Athens to tell his people that they had actually won, which was a big surprise. You know, it couldn't be like a text from Los Angeles to saying the Raptors, wherever it was, somebody will correct me, that we won the NBA championship, right? There were no cell phones, there were no texts. Somebody had to run, not quite from Los Angeles, but they had to run about 200 kilometers. It's a long way. Multiple marathons. And he ran 200 kilometers wearing 40 pounds of body armor in the heat. Okay? So just imagine that, right? This is like running from here to well past London, Ontario, wearing 40 pounds of body armor in hot weather without stopping. No water stops, nobody helping you, right? So he got there and he said, we won, we are victorious, and he collapsed and died. So that was the first known sports-related sudden death. But that then sort of led to this concept. I'm going to tell you it's an incorrect concept, that you can exercise yourself to death. Now, of course, you can overdo it if you're crazy, but we're talking about sort of everyday type of activities. So the rest of it is pretty self-explanatory. If indeed it is true that too much exercise is too much, well, how much is too much? Is it okay to run a marathon? Is it okay to run an ultra marathon? Is it okay to run 100 kilometers? Is it okay to run 500 kilometers? Who knows? And is this true for everybody, or is it true only for some people? If any of us were to start training now and run 5 hours a day to train for some event, will any one of us get into trouble? And if it's any one of us, how can you tell if you're destined to be a world champion or you're destined to be somebody who gets into trouble? I can tell you now we don't know that. So, what's an athlete? Well, the guy on the bottom left, these are the real Iron Men. So, is Arnold Schwarzenegger an athlete? Well, he's a weightlifter. That's a kind of a sport. Abebe Bikila was the first of the modern era of athletes from what's called the Rift Valley in Ethiopia. These are individuals who live at very high altitude, probably for environmental and cultural reasons. These kids have to run to school, so those of you who go to school, you may take the bus or the subway or even walk. They have to run 10 kilometers in both directions every day to go to school. So just imagine, just think of 10 kilometers. That's pretty far, right? That would be like from here to Coxwell and Gerrard, no, way further than that. And you have to run there every morning to get to school and run back. So these kids are used to running, and Abebe Bikila was the first of now all the world champion marathon runners, long distance runners come from that part of the world. Maybe because it's at high altitude, there's less oxygen, so their bodies are adapted to be more efficient. Maybe because they're starting to run it to school when they're 7 years old. Maybe because they're genetically endowed to have skinny legs, and it's a long story, we'll get to that if you want, to be better runners. He ran the Rome Marathon in bare feet. And he won the race, and he was very, very famous. And then since then, there's been many others. There's other famous athletes. Steve Prefontaine is a very famous North American runner who was a world champion marathoner back in the 1960s and 70s. When we talk about sport, not all sport is the same. This is a bit of a dense slide. I'm sorry about that, but it sort of reminds us. It's sort of a bit complicated, but there's two aspects of sport. One is physical effort. So weightlifting, it doesn't demand that your body uses a lot of oxygen. Weightlifting, here, let's look on the top left here. It says here, weightlifting, for example. This has what's called a high static component. Static meaning your body is not moving through space. So rowing, for example, you're using a lot of oxygen because you're moving, but you're also lifting something heavy. So weightlifting is the prototype of what's called a static rather than dynamic sport. You're tensing your muscles and you're pushing against a heavy resistance, but you're not moving through space. So that's a physical demand on the heart to push blood into exercising muscles. There's a completely opposite kind of sport or kind of activity, which is down at the bottom left, which is long distance running would be the prototype, which is low static but high dynamic component. You're not lifting a weight. When you're running, you're just moving your body through space. Your body's not that heavy, but it requires your heart to pump a lot of blood because the exercising muscles, it's not a lot of weight. When you push off to run, you're basically lifting the weight of your leg. It's not a ton of weight lifting. That's why runners can have very skinny legs. Their muscles are not very strong. You've probably seen cross-country runners. The best cross-country runners weigh 125 pounds, maximum, 120 pounds. They're really skinny. And their muscles are not very big, but their muscles are packed with these energy-containing organelles called mitochondria, which allow the muscles to use a lot of oxygen. And the muscles are working fast, not necessarily hard in the sense of lifting a lot of weight, because the blood has to circulate very fast in exercise in runners. So it's a different kind of exercise. Some are a bit of both. Swimmers have both a dynamic component because they're moving through space, but water is much more resistant than air, so you have to pull hard. Basketball players do a little both. They lift weights, plus they do a lot of running. Soccer players the same. Cyclists have both a static component because they're pushing against a resistance, especially up hills, but they also have a dynamic component because they're moving quickly and exerting a lot of energy. Does that make sense? So it used to be thought that there's very different heart adaptations to these different kinds of activities. We're less sure than we used to be. But one of the questions we think about when we deal with potential problems related to sport or adaptation to sport is it depends on the kind of sport. A weightlifter, an Arnold Schwarzenegger, may have very different cardiac consequences than an Abebe Bikila. And stop me if I'm not making any sense. So how long does it take for your heart to become an athlete's heart? Well, the amazing part, it takes about 3 or 6 months. It doesn't take 20 years. So this is, don't worry about the details. I'm just going to give you that, we could spend 4 hours talking about the details, so please forgive me about this. But just look at the slide, and you can see the bottom left is somebody who's sedentary. These are individuals who volunteered for a research project. And if you could volunteer, if you're already an athlete, you're not eligible for this. You have to be a couch potato. So these are middle-aged couch potatoes. If some of you are couch potatoes, don't tell me. These are middle-aged couch potatoes living in Texas. And there's a famous researcher named Ben Levine who has been doing this for 30 years. He's got a whole big research program. He does some fantastic work. So they gathered a whole bunch of people who said, I want to do a marathon, but they'd always been couch potatoes, maybe since their teens. And then they had repeated measurements of their heart over time while they were training for a marathon. In the first 3 months of training, they would just be walking. They weren't running yet because they were out of shape. So the first 3 months, every day they would go for a 30-minute walk, then they would go slow jogging, and only after 6 months, you can see the arrow here, did they start exercising vigorously, like going for long runs. To train for a marathon, you have to run about 50 kilometers a week, which is a fair bit of exercise. It's about an hour a day. But prior to that, you can see as you go up the left-hand side, it's called the y-axis. The TRIMP is just a name we give to the amount of effort expended. It's related to how hard you're working and how long you're working and how fast you're working. All of these are components of how hard your body and your heart are working with exercise. And on the x-axis, or along the bottom line, you have months. So over time, you can see that you're exercising more and more and more. And the heart may get stronger and stronger. So I want you to look at this part. Can you see the arrow here? This is, at this point, these individuals who are formerly couch potatoes are now jogging 3, 4, 5 times a week, okay? This is what happens to their heart. When they start, the LV mass is the size of the heart. It's like the size of your biceps. It's just a measure of how much muscle there is in the heart. You can see that at the end of 3 months, the heart has gotten bigger. And at the end of 6 months, the heart has gotten even bigger. You keep training, your heart hardly grows at all. So what this tells us is that, and the same thing, the LV is called the left ventricle, the left pumping chamber. The RV is the right pumping chamber. The bottom line here, The details are not important. The bottom line is it does not take very much sport or activity to get your heart to remodel. If you want a big biceps, you do not have to lift 300 pounds of weight. Now, it's a little different with what's called skeletal muscle. If you want a big bulging biceps, you do have to lift heavy weights, and the heavier weights you lift, the bigger your bicep becomes. So if you want to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, you got to pump a lot of iron. But if you want a bigger heart, a stronger heart, you don't have to be an Olympic athlete. You have to basically jog an hour a day, 3 or 4 times a week. Now, you can get fitter and stronger and more competitive if you exercise more, but the important thing here is that the heart is very adaptable. It learns very quickly to become stronger and fitter. Now, if you're training for a marathon, at the end of the 12 months, it'll get a little bit stronger and bigger, but most of the growth of the heart muscle happens with a relatively small amount of exercise. Let's just skip that. So now there's tons of fake news. Everything I'm going to show you, yeah, please stop me. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, how did you measure the heart
Yeah, with ultrasound. So the ultrasound, it's a probe. It's not painful, no risk to it. It's a probe, which is basically like a radar gun. That's all it is. I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version. This radar gun just shoots out ultrasound. It's sound waves, right? How many of you have heard an echo? Right? So this is echo. It's no different. When you have an echo, I yell and I hear back echo, echo, right? Those are sound waves. My mouth sends waves of sound to the wall. The waves bounce back into my ear. How far that wall is from me is, you can tell because it takes longer for the echo waves to come back. Now, if you get very sophisticated with a special ultrasound machine, what happens is the sound waves bounce back from something, and if you have a chamber of the heart, which is full of blood, and there's a wall at the other end, you send the sound waves back, and the sound waves bounce back to you. And a computer just measures how long it took those sound waves to bounce back from the probe, right? The ribs are directly underneath the probe, the heart's further away. There's a chamber, so the back wall is farther from you than the front wall of the heart, so it takes longer for the sound waves to bounce back. And the computer just translates the time it takes for the sound waves to bounce back. These are waves you can't hear with, it's like a dog whistle, right? You can't hear the sound waves. Their frequency is different, but they're sound waves. And then the computer translates the time it takes for the sound waves to bounce back into an image. And the image is, in fact, what the heart looks like. So you can reconstruct, using the technology, a picture of the heart in real time moving. And you can see how thick the walls are. That make sense? So that's an ultrasound, and it's a very accurate measure of the size of the chamber and the size of the wall, right? Because the wall is muscle and the chamber is just full of blood. So when any of you or your friends or your family or my patients go on the internet, they're going to see all this kind of fake news. Lots of fake news around, I'm sorry to tell you. Some of the fake news is exercise harmful? And it isn't, but that's what your patients are reading. This is complete BS. What they're reading is this. Now this red line is not mine. The question mark is mine, and the word BS is mine. But the other, this is actually a real research paper from a well-known researcher, and I think it's completely full of BS. The belief is that if you do too much, cardiovascular events are things like dying or things like heart attacks, bad things that can happen to people. Everybody agrees. Every researcher on the planet agrees that if you're a couch potato here on the left, you may have, not everybody, but you're at risk to have a heart attack or heart problems, strokes, etc. If you exercise moderately, then you're doing yourself some good. The question is, what about if you're training for a marathon or a triathlon or the Hawaii Ironman and you're training all the time? Are you making it worse for yourself? You notice it's not as bad as a couch potato, but are you worse off if you train really hard than if you train moderately? There's no evidence for this, but that's what people talk about. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the kinds of activities that many people do. This would be running, just if you want to translate this into what do we mean by intensive exercise. So we mean by, at the extreme, it's not extremely bad, it's just at the extreme, we're talking about 3 hours a day of walking 3 miles per hour. So this is a brisk walk for 3 hours a day. I don't know about you, but I don't have 3 hours a day to go walking. Or you can exercise for an hour a day, 7 days a week, fairly vigorously. This is running a 10-minute mile, right? If you're training for a marathon, that's the kind of thing you would do. This is 10 times the minimum activity required for heart health. So it's quite a lot. And if you do that, your likelihood of dying is reduced by about 50%. Don't worry about this thing. This is sort of the fake news part. People look at these numbers. It turns out that in this particular research study, there were a handful of people who did exercise like 3 hours a day. One of them died in a car accident, one of them died from cancer, and one of them had some other health event. One of them, I think, committed suicide, not because he was an athlete, just bad luck. And so when you have very small numbers, we don't have time to get into a long song and dance about statistical science, but one of the things, I hate to tell you this, or maybe you'll like to hear this, if you're going to be a scientist, you have to understand math and statistics. You cannot be a scientist if you don't understand fairly well how to think about statistics, probability, and measurement. Unfortunately, there's no other way to become a scientist. So one of the major limitations that's led to all kinds of misinformation in this field is if you have a very small number of individuals who are serious athletes and they die from reasons that are absolutely unconnected to their heart, then that gets labeled as, well, they died, maybe it was their heart. These things here, and stop me if I'm boring you or you know what these are, these things are called error bars. Little diamond is the actual measure. The error bars is our degree of uncertainty about this finding, okay? And therefore we can't take it too seriously. Imagine you're a weight loss researcher and you're running a weight loss program and you have a brand new diet that's going to help people lose weight, okay? You've invented this great diet, it's better than Dr. Oz's acacia berries and it's fantastic, you're going to make $1 million, and you put a lot of people on this diet. And how do you know if the diet's working? Well, you bring them back and you put the people on a scale and you start to weigh them. But imagine that you had a bunch of people who can't come in to be weighed, so they send you a photograph of themselves taken from 300 meters away through a bad camera. Can you tell if they lost weight or not? Of course not. You're going to have a lot of uncertainty about this measure. So whenever we're talking about measuring things, we have to understand how confident we are that what we're measuring is actually truth. And what's happened here is that the researchers took things that they can't be confident about and mistakenly labeled it as truth. This is closer to truth because this is a very large number of people. And what this tells us is that, again, up and down the left-hand side is the likelihood of dying. 1 is the equivalent of a couch potato. The smaller the number, this is now a fraction, 0.25 means you're much less likely to die than a couch potato. And in red are the people who exercise every day, and in blue are the people who are exercising only on weekends. And a little bit to our collective surprise, if you're a weekend warrior, you get just the same benefit from exercise as the exercise every day. So it doesn't seem to matter. Just how you exercise makes no difference. 8 hours 1 day a week versus 1 hour 7 days a week doesn't matter. All of these individuals, whether they're regular exercisers or weekend warriors, as they exercise more, their chances of dying from any reason goes down, and it's always less than a couch potato. And the more they exercise, going from left to right, the more benefit they get. So the bottom line here for exercise, it doesn't matter how you get it, doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter how often, it's just how much exercise that you do. So how do we know this? Well, this is a wonderful example of both sociology and science. In Sweden, there's this race called the Vasaloppet. This is like the Toronto Marathon on steroids. Cross-country skiing is culturally a big deal in Sweden because the sun never shines and it snows 11 months of the year. Actually, Swedes are wonderful people and it's a nice place. It's not that bad, but it's a winter country. and cross-country skiing is kind of their national sport. So every year there's this major race. It's about 150 kilometers. That's a long way. That's like from here to Kitchener by cross-country skiing. And there's people in ages ranging in age from 2 to 90 who enter this race, and they train all year. You enter on the web, and I looked this up. December the 10th or something is when you enter. The race is always in February. December the 10th, they open up the race so you can register on the web. Within 5 minutes, they have 100,000 entries. So if you want to get on there, you have to be up at midnight, logging in and clicking, like buying tickets for Hamilton, right? You got to keep doing a rock concert until you get into this race. So it's a huge deal, and the country stops. The businesses are shut down. It's like a national holiday, and people are in this race. The interest. So this is researchers taking advantage of this event, and they took advantage of this event by asking the question: well, people have been doing this race for 50 years. We are pretty sure that if you're fit enough to cross-country ski 150 kilometers, you've been exercising, right? So the question is, what happens to these people 50 years from now? Are they still alive? Do they die? Do their joints fall apart? Does their heart fall apart? What are the consequences over 50 years? And the people enter this race every year, so we know that they're staying fit. So question number one is, what happens to these people? Do they get heart trouble or do they not get heart trouble? Question number two is there any relationship to how fast you are? Presumably, if you're a winner, you worked much harder, you trained harder than if you just happened to finish. So we don't really know for sure how fit these people are, but we're pretty certain if you're close to the winning time, those of you who've ever run a marathon, if you run a marathon in 2.5 hours or 3 hours, you're pretty damn fit. If you run a marathon in 5 hours, you're still really fit, but not quite as fit as somebody who ran it in 2.5 or 3 hours. So what happened to these people? So here's what happened. These are, the Swedes found a whole bunch of, there aren't too many Swede couch potatoes, but they found them. These are non-skiers. That doesn't mean that they're couch potatoes necessarily, but they're not avid athletes. And going from left to right is the likelihood of dying. So you can see that over 25 years, this is, some of these people are now 90 years old. Everybody dies eventually. But if you're a skier, you're much less likely to die. The lower you are on this scale, the less likely you are to die. So over time, the sedentary individuals or the non-skiers increasingly more likely to die than the skiers from any cause. It turns out that athletes are less likely to die from heart disease, from cancer, from lung disease, and from Alzheimer's. So sport protects you from every kind of disorder you can possibly think about. It's not only good for the heart, but it's good for other things as well. And it turns out that this is now it's a bit backward. 100 means you're the winner. The fastest skiers are on the left. The slowest skiers are on the right, okay? And again, down is good, up is less good. So the further down you are, the less likely you are to die. And so you can see that for men, the faster you are, the more protection you get from dying than if you're slower. These people are way better where the arrow is than sedentary or couch potatoes, but the faster you are, the more benefit you get with respect to living longer. And women, as is appropriate, live longer than men, which is as it should be, and they get the same kind of protection. Women live longer in this context because they're much less likely to get heart disease. Everybody dies eventually. If you live to 100, we're all going to be, what I tell patients is I got good news and bad news, you're going to live to be 100. You can think that's good news or bad news if you're an athlete. Now we're talking about dying usually in your 60s or 70s or 80s. So the fitter you are, the longer you live. What does this mean population-wise? This is kind of interesting. If you look at the changes over time. In 1980, this is marathoners in the US. 11% were women, and 26% were age over 40. In 2012, half of marathoners are over 40, and there's now almost as many women as men. So the good news is that women are exercising more and more, and the good news is that older people are doing things which absolutely protect your heart, and they're exercising more and more. Now, that's all been good news. Is there any bad news? Well, there's some uncertainty here. I don't want to give you the idea that exercise can never, ever be harmful. If you already have heart problems, let's say you've had a heart attack, or you have hardening of the arteries because you are overweight and you have all kinds of illnesses, you have a family history of heart disease, you're a smoker, there's many things that contribute to developing heart disease. And some people have heart disease and don't know it. Not at your age, so don't worry about it. But people do develop heart disease. If you have heart disease, the question comes up often for a cardiologist or a sports cardiologist is, well, my heart's not perfect. Am I going to harm myself by exercise? And now it gets a little bit tricky. The likelihood that the slide is a bit complicated, and let me go to the next one actually because it's better. I'm going to try to explain the slide. It's a bit of a complicated slide. If you exercise and you have heart trouble and you dash down the street to run a race, your chances of having a heart attack or dying suddenly during the race is higher than if you'd stayed and watched Netflix, okay? By quite a bit. It's probably 10 times higher. But if you run regularly, your chances of dying overall, because you're not running every day, or even if you're running every day, if you run an hour a day, that's 23 hours a day when you're not running. So over a period of a week, you spend most of your time not running, right? So if you're an athlete, the chances that you have a disaster happen while you are exercising goes up, but the overall chances of a disaster go down. Does that make sense? Because you're spending most of your time sitting around. So this is the way it looks. Let's look at the people in red. This is a person with heart trouble who's sedentary. They don't exercise. They go out and they start to shovel snow, or they run a race and they haven't trained. Their chances of dying, right where the star is, during shoveling snow in a couch potato who's already got heart trouble, hope it doesn't happen too often, goes up by 100-fold. So during the 30 minutes they're shoveling snow, their chances are 100 times greater that they're going to have a disaster than if they just stayed inside and had a scotch, okay? That's the sedentary person. If you're an athlete, you're in the blue line, meaning your chances of dying are reduced by 50%. Now, if you go and exercise, and you're exercising 1 or 2 times a week, and you go out and shovel snow, your chances are still higher while you're shoveling snow, but not higher by as much. And if you exercise 5 times a week, then your risk is much less than a sedentary person, but it still goes up while you're shoveling snow. So it's a point of not diminishing return. You can't get around it. That's just the math. The math is that even an Olympic level athlete, if their chances of having a heart attack, for example, while they're just in our everyday life is 1 in a million, okay? Let's say I'm a Olympic level, I'm not, but let's say I was an Olympic level runner. My chances of dying suddenly in the next year is 1 in 100,000. That's the actual number. I'm now going to run as fast as I can 10 kilometers until I'm blue in the face. During this hour, my chances of dying suddenly have gone from 1 in 100,000 to 10 in 100,000. Still very low risk, but I've multiplied my risk tenfold. Does that make sense? If I'm a couch potato, my risk of having a heart attack just sitting around is 30 in 100,000. It's much higher. If I now run 10 kilometers as fast as I can, my risk has gone to 300 in 100,000. Still a small number, but much, much greater. So you can't get around the fact that exercise does increase your risk temporarily, but not as much as it would be in a sedentary person, which is why rarely we see tragedies like people dying during sport in a bicycle race, or dying in the marathon, or dying during some physical activity. You sometimes see pro athletes. It's usually during activity. It's rare, but it happens during. But it doesn't mean they shouldn't be running. It just means we have to suck up the fact that that is the highest moment of risk. So this is the paradox is, older athletes, we don't have a chance to talk about coronary calcium. These are deposits in the plumbing, if you like, of the heart that athletes get. These athletes do get a benefit. This is a little bit out of context, but the bottom line is the fittest have the greatest health benefits of athletes, even though they're not completely immune from having cardiac problems. Okay. The challenge is that when you have a marathon, you have 100,000 runners in a marathon. Every year in the New York Marathon, 100,000 runners. I don't think they have 100,000, they may have 50,000, but let's say you had 2 New York marathons back in one year and then one in the next year. Usually you have either one person in every marathon or every second marathon who dies suddenly. That's not a lot of people, but it gets a lot of press. So last year in the Toronto Marathon, somebody died suddenly out of 25,000 people. That happens. It doesn't mean marathons are dangerous, it just means they're not completely without risk. The problem is that in the general population, maybe 5 to 10% of all adults over the age of 45 will have some minor degree of hardening of the arteries. Some of them may be smokers or have high blood pressure or diabetes, but some of them just have hardening of the arteries because they have bad luck. Maybe they've inherited it from, it's genetic, they've inherited the tendency. And we don't know who those people are. And when they run a marathon, they now are at risk for developing a problem. The odds are very small, but this gets a lot of press. So what people believe is, oh, somebody died during a marathon, don't run marathons. What we should be saying is, if you run regularly, you will prolong your life almost all the time, but you may be at risk. If you get in a car and you drive down the 401, most people don't have problems riding down the 401, but once in a while, somebody gets into a car accident and dies. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be driving, it just means we should be driving carefully. This is the most important thing that you have to know. The amount of time you prolong your life by running is actually spent running. This is in case you want to be a runner. It's just a bit of a joke. Okay, we don't have a chance to talk about athletes who have, it's a whole long story about sudden deaths, but we don't really have time to talk about that. This is some research that we've done. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that there is a risk, and the risk in a young, healthy person with sport of dying unexpectedly, this could happen to anybody in this room, I'm sorry to tell you, the risk is about 1 in 100,000, which is not negligible. If you have 100,000, how many people are there in Toronto? There's 6 million people in the GTA. About 3 million of them are between the ages of 10 and about 40. Out of those 3 million, roughly 1 in 10 is an athlete, a competitive athlete. So there's about 300,000 people in the GTA that are competitive athletes. Competitive meaning they belong to a team and they exercise and they do sport regularly, competitively. And every year, a handful of them will die suddenly from a heart problem. So that gets a lot of press because 18-year-old dying, a fit person playing hockey or soccer or basketball, that's a big deal. And part of my research and part of my practice is trying to figure out why is that the case and how do we look after these individuals, how do we prevent this from happening, can we predict it, can we prevent it? It's a long story and the short answer is very hard to predict, very hard to prevent. But I want to give you a reflection, a sort of a reality check on how common or uncommon this is. So just remember the number. If you're an athlete, your chances of dying suddenly, unexpectedly, is 1 in 100,000. That's 0, okay? It's a bit hard to see. If you go hang gliding, your chances of dying is 1 in 560. I'm not saying don't go hang gliding, you just have to know this. If you're a skydiver, your chance of dying is 1 in 100,000, similar to an athlete running a marathon untrained. In boxing, it's 1 in 2,000, pretty dangerous. In scuba diving, it's not without risk. In motorbike racing, it's 1 in 1,000. Don't be a Grand Prix racer. I guess you can make a lot of money, but your chances of dying is actually 1 in 100. Snowboarding is 1 in 2 million. It's pretty safe. Skiing is relatively safe. Climbing is really high. You have to translate the numbers here. If you go to Nepal, your chances of not coming back are 1 in 167. So you can go to Nepal, but I don't recommend it. Go to Kathmandu and have some pakoras. It's much safer. Mountain hiking is 8 times more risky than running a marathon. I'm not saying don't go mountain hiking, but what I tell all my patients, or I tell people who ask me, well, isn't it dangerous for me to exercise? Yes, there are some risks, but much less than hiking. Probably not much more than snowboarding. bicycling, your chances of dying in an accident, if you're cycling, in a given year, is just a little less. I'm not saying don't go cycling. I cycle, you should all cycle. But we have to be realistic. Everything we do has risks. So the risk of dying from sport, even though it's talked about a lot, it's all over the internet, there's this belief that endurance sport is risky. It does have some risks, but the risks are similar or less than the risks of many other things. Base jumping, we're not even going to talk about. Don't do it. So this is actually getting very small print, so let's just not worry about that. Let me stop there. We could talk a lot about the specific kinds of heart disease that can make you predisposed to life-threatening events during sport, but that's very sort of technical and detailed, so let me leave that for another time. Thank you very much.